Hi, this is Amy Showalter. I'm here with the Engagement Edge to share with you how to recognize and remove confirmation bias from your decision making in campaigns and so forth. How I got to this point in terms of recognizing mine, and it's something we always have to be cognizant of, is when I met my colleague, Dr. Kelton Rhodes, at a session with his mentor at the time, Dr. Robert Cialdini at Arizona State University. And we had one of those hallway conversations, and he said, you know, Amy, I really think that you can predict what causes elected officials to change their minds on certain issues. You'd need to really, he said, I think there might be an algorithm, behind that. And I think you could do that. It would be extremely labor intensive to conduct that kind of research, but I think there's a way to find out. I think there's a way to find out what really causes them to change their minds. To which I replied, well, I know what changes their minds. It's grassroots input from constituents in the district, from voters in the district. And he got a chuckle out of that because he knows that there's more to it than that. And I was extremely biased in terms of my perspective that grassroots is what works, because you see, that's how I was raised. I was raised leading a very successful grassroots program at Nationwide Insurance, and I saw the power of that. And so that was my bias, that grassroots is what worked, and the lobbying and the political action committees and the coalitions and those tactics, those are fine, but it's really just the grassroots that makes the difference. Well, I'll get to the rest of the story in a moment, but what I had was a big case of confirmation bias, and there are several ways this manifests itself. We hear about unconscious bias. We hear a lot about that today in the workplace on issues of diversity and inclusion. So we look at people in a biased way many times. We also look at tactics in a biased way in terms of what we're good at, what we like. See, my preferred tactic was grassroots because I felt like that's what I saw. That was my strength. That's what I knew to be correct. And so to me, that's all that mattered. That was my bias, my unconscious bias there. And it goes with our strength bias. We tend to move to our strengths in the workplace, and we tend to recommend and do what we do well. The lobbyist is going to want more lobbying. The grassroots professional is going to want more advocacy. The PAC professional is going to want more strategic PAC disbursements. So we have to be thinking about all the options available to us, So back to the rest of the story in terms of how I learned a better way and learned how to remove my bias. Kelton and I started working together on that very research project that he mentioned, and we looked at over 20 of Fortune's most powerful lobbying groups. At the time, they made a list of the most powerful lobbying groups, and we asked them to sit down with us and tell us about a legislator who they successfully persuaded and one whom they did not persuade on the same legislative issue. And we had over 30 or so, actually it was 70 variables that we had. It was a long questionnaire. And many of them, we went through this by hand in person. Some of them, they filled this out, and then I would conduct an interview or a phone call with them to go over this. So we had lots of different variables in that process to determine if they, when they were successful in changing their mind. Everything from the tenure of the lawmaker. Were they a freshman, or were they a veteran lawmaker? What about the PAC? I'll get to that in a minute. What about coalitions, the grassroots strength? Was there a lot of grassroots involved or not? Was it key contacts or just or the more broad-based grassroots? What about the lobbying component? What about scandals? Did the lawmaker have a scandalous history or background that might have affected their decision making? What about the coalition engagement? What about face-to-face contact versus other kinds of contact with that lawmaker? So we looked at all, these are just a few, as I said, of over 70 variables that we looked at. So we looked at a lot. And we came up with 5 predictors that tend to make a lawmaker change his or her mind. And one of the top 5 was right here, my political action committee. Now, after the giant thud everyone heard at the time of that, when I was reading that report, was me falling on the floor, because I didn't think this would show prominence at all. I didn't think that it would matter. But it wasn't just, did they contribute to that lawmaker? It was, did they give the maximum contribution to that lawmaker? Okay, did they give the maximum contribution to that lawmaker? Face-to-face was another important component. The more face-to-face meetings that were held with the lawmaker, the more likely they were to change their mind. And those were just a few in the top 5. But what that taught me And really what led to our political action committee practice today is this finding, is that I realized that it really was an important part of the decision-making process, whether or not lawmakers will admit to it or not, in a lawmaker's mindset. And it helped me develop that way of thinking in a different way, to look at, there's lots of factors. There may be certain things I prefer to engage in, or I prefer clients to engage in, but it takes everything to make it successful. So how do you remove bias from your decision making? How do you remove that? Well, as one of the organizations represented on our Grassroots Influence Pulse survey, the GRIP, you maybe have heard of the GRIP research, Grassroots Influence Pulse. There were 3 groups mentioned in that: the Rifle Association, AARP, and the National Association of Realtors. And I promised them that I wouldn't share I interviewed them as to what they thought they did well and where they need to improve. And I promised them I would not attribute their quotes, so I can't tell you which group said this, but more than one said that we're ruthless in how we evaluate our campaigns. Because, Amy, many people look at a particular tech tool, a particular tactic on a winning campaign, and they think that that represents why we won. And what we have to realize is that just because you like it and it's fun, or you use that tool really well, doesn't mean that was the factor in winning. That's not what always brings you to that victory. So he said, well, we're really ruthless in looking at what worked and what didn't. And even if we like something, we tend to back off if we find it's not as successful. So I would say there's a lot of techniques, but I would say number 1, ruthless evaluation of your campaigns when you're successful. And also have your control group look at when you're not successful. Okay, look at those unsuccessful influence attempts, compare the 2, and move from there. I removed my bias. I'd been in the government relations profession probably 10 or 15 years before I got to this point. It took me a while, but I got there. And I know you need an integrated approach to move the needle with elected officials, with undecided elected officials. So remove your bias, be open. Don't just do what's fun and easy. Do what matters and what works, and ruthlessly evaluate. Thanks. This is Amy, live and uncut on the Engagement Edge.